securing land and territorial rights of indigenous peoples, equitable participation in decision making, for ensuring the survival of biodiversity, how we can improve planetary health, and to mitigate climate change. And this side event is going to be focusing on the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, which is being welcomed by many of the indigenous peoples and also celebrated by many of the civil society organizations and member states. As you know, that one of the theme or the vision of the CBD is living in harmony with nature. And in this new biodiversity framework, there are some very important elements. For example, it focuses on a human rights-based approach. It also focuses on recognizing the territorial and land rights of indigenous peoples. It also includes free, prior, and informed consent, and also on issues of the environmental defenders, and also gives a special reference to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So it has a lot of the elements that we have been fighting for, and therefore it's one of the reasons why it is being very much welcomed by different actors, including indigenous peoples. Now, this whole issue of human rights-based approach and this vision for living in harmony with nature reflects this issue of covering the aspect of aesthetics and ethics as well. Meaning that how much do we value and appreciate nature and natural resources. It is also about ethics, because we're also looking at behavior of these global citizens that governs our culture and way of doing things. Now, because it's talking about human rights-based approach in conservation and to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, what this means is also that fundamentally it must be framed and approach must recognize the pre-existing rights of indigenous peoples, meaning that we have always had our own laws, we have had our own cultures that appreciates the beauty and also the values of nature in respect, and therefore living in harmony with nature. What this means also that when we talk about territorial and land rights, it also means that these rights must be given, the content of these rights must be given by our own indigenous laws, because these are pre-existing rights, and that is fundamental when we talk about human rights-based approach to conservation. Now in this side event, we have a number of very distinguished panelists who will be sharing with us from indigenous peoples organizations and movement leaders, civil society organization leaders, and the UN agencies to share their perspective on this Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework, with particular reference to land and territorial rights of indigenous peoples. Some of the questions that we'll be looking at is, how can this actually be implemented on the ground? Especially when it comes to the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, because that will determine how effectively this will be implemented. And along with this, of course, is also that kind of enabling conditions that needs to be created, because everything is not rosy or normal in terms of the situation that we are facing, with a lot of pushbacks and regression, and actually there are many laws that are designed to dismantle indigenous people's rights. But in this context, we have this biodiversity framework. So this is going to entail a lot of challenges. We also would be looking at some of the issues in terms of the finance and other kind of resources that is needed, and how can this be achieved and met for indigenous peoples and communities on the ground. Also, we'll be looking at partnerships, which is of critical importance, whether it's civil society, communities, peasants, indigenous peoples, governments, companies, etc., etc. Right? So this, of course, biodiversity framework is also really important in the context of achieving the sustainable development goals. There are many goals to which this will be addressing, but particularly it becomes very important to be looking at the kind of partnership, because that partnership will also by and large determine the kind of enabling condition that is needed and the resources that is needed, and how communities' initiatives, vision and interests would be realized and achieved through that kind of a partnership. So let's start this side event. We will begin this side event with an opening remark from E. Mint. She is the director of Point back home in Myanmar, but right now she is also the new expert member of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues from Asia. As the speakers' turn come, I will be reading out their names so that we can save time.
The discussion, I also would like to start by highlighting how important land and natural resources are for indigenous people. I just want to say that for land, it is like the heart for human being. For indigenous people, land is like the heart. That is the part of human body that we rely on it. We are living on it. Everything we live is very much connected to it. And if we say about land, there is also forest that indigenous people rely on. For that, I want to say it is look like a hand for our indigenous people. We use our hand, we use our forest to live in a self-sufficient economy and in a sustainable way. And also, when we talk about land, there is also mountain. Mountain is like the head for us, that in mountain, we have a lot of sacred land, everything we value, and the way we live also is closely to those natural resources that is in mountain. Another thing I want to highlight is the river. So sometimes when people talk about indigenous people land, river and water are also part of our life as well. And river is like the blood for us, like a human being need a blood in our body. We also rely on this. And we also want to highlight about the biodiversity. I just want to say biodiversity is like the nose for our part of our body that we breathe. We need to breathe every day air. We need to, especially we will know in COVID, the value of oxygen we need to breathe. And the biodiversity is like the nose. For indigenous people, if there is no biodiversity, it means that we cannot breathe anymore, we cannot live anymore. That's why everything is very much interconnected and linked for us in a way we live and for our future as well. And we are in this United Nations building in New York. So I would like to highlight about the importance of 3M for our implementation of this Kunming-Montreal biodiversity framework, because many times we always come up with like a decade and a 10-year plan strategy, everything, and if we don't implement on the ground and make change on the ground, we already know that climate change is alarming, and it is no longer called a change. It is actually a climate emergency, and also biodiversity are really facing threats and on a daily basis. And for this, I would like to say that for this time, from now on, when we try to make changes And when we try to commit for the changes that is needed for urgent action, then we need to first think about the first end is nature-based solution. For indigenous people, we can offer this nature-based solution because the way we live is also really on this basic as well. And the second end is norm for negotiation, because like we need dialogue in order to carry out and in order to accommodate the different stakeholders taking part to be the solution for this. In this negotiation and consultation, we need right-based approach to development, because without right and without human beings who take care of this natural environment, that is indigenous people, then how can we make real change and action for this? That's why the right-based approach to development, taking into consideration of indigenous people rights, especially free, prior, and informed consent, is very important for the coming year and time that we need to make change within the short limit we have. The last end I would like to highlight is no one left behind. We always hear this in the SDG. And then even in reality, we're still facing so many gaps and challenges in terms of participation. And then when we talk about participation, being just taking part in one action is not the meaningful participation. We are also talking about the being part of the decision making, to be fully, effectively engaged in the whole process. That's why in order to carry out the challenges of the world, we indigenous people are together and be ready to be the solution for this. And there is a need to pay attention to the implementation of UNPFII in a way that our important role is really respected and taken care of. This is what I want to highlight as part of today's discussion, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, E. As you highlighted, land and territories are our hearts, and then we also embody biodiversity as indigenous people, so thank you very much. Now let me move on to our next speaker, our first panelist. Viviana is an indigenous activist and as well as a leader for a very long time now. I have known her for many, many years. She served in the CBD Secretariat for the Article AJ for Indigenous Peoples. So we're really fortunate to have her to be presenting for us on this issue of this land and territorial rights on this biodiversity framework. So Viviana, please take the floor. Thank you.
Good afternoon to all. Thank you so much to all the organizers for this opportunity. I will speak on behalf of the AIPP, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. And I want to share that there was a very long negotiation of the CUMIN Montreal biodiversity framework for 4 years, where in middle of the pandemic with COVID, with virtual meetings, and all the time was the pressure to the indigenous leader: if you are not participating in the process, your proposal will be not there. And why we participate in the process very active? Because we were worried. You know that the biodiversity and climate change, the situation is worse than 10 years ago. And we know that the pressure will be on indigenous land and territories of indigenous peoples. So it's a really high risk. For this, what we wanted to have in the framework, because we wanted to have the framework as a tool to respect and promote and support the indigenous people rights, especially to rights to land and territories. What we wanted is new. Why is new? Because it's a recognition of the indigenous land and territories. In general, up to now, the areas that are considered globally that conserve biodiversity are protected areas, or other based OECMs, other areas based conservation that is more broader, but it's not very clear what is. But it was not indigenous land and territories. And we pointed out that our land and territories are conserving, this is a reality, are conserving biodiversity. In some places, in my countries, the only areas where high biodiversity is indigenous land and territories. So we present evidence like IPP's Global Assessment of Biodiversity. We present other studies that show this reality and say these areas are indigenous and land and territories, are not protected areas, and are well protected without getting any cent for this conservation. And we know also that some areas that are areas as national parks are less protected and has less biodiversity than indigenous land and territories. For this, for us, it was a moment, the historical moment, to change the paradigm, to change that indigenous people no need to have this declaration inside their territories as protected areas or ECM. With the recognition of land and territories, the world can ensure that the biodiversity is protected. And I want to share that in my country, of course, many times, many NGOs with good intentions went to the communities and told them, no, why you don't convert your territories in protected areas. And unfortunately, the most of the law on protected area doesn't recognize the rights of indigenous people inside the areas. Even it's worse, it's restrictions of this, even the land. So for this is like, we want now, we know that after the approval, that it was approved at very last minute, it was very hard the negotiations. Even in some moment, the idea was that the recognition of the land and territories, it will be included inside the protected areas or ECMs, and parties, many countries say, oh, but some communities have their land rights, but they don't put this land for conservation of biodiversity. We say, no, this is part of identity, so this is a conserved, we don't put like a protected area inside our territories. We just conserve biodiversity because it's our mother earth. So for this is like, it was really hard negotiations, and we have the text of Target 3, which include, and this is the most important for the implementation, include a new, we say new pathway, new ways to recognize what indigenous people were doing from millennia, that they are conserving biodiversity in their land and territories, and why is the key action now is this recognition. So this recognition of land and territories. In the case of my country, that is Argentina, it could be collective land rights to indigenous communities. But also in the same target 3, we include the respect of the rights of indigenous people. Because we know that there will be, with the increase of 50 by 50% of protected areas, there will be also intentions to establish protected areas in indigenous land and territories. For this, the respect of the rights of indigenous people include the respect of liberal and informed consent, no protected area. This is was one of the more worry that we had during the negotiations. No protected areas without the respect of liberal and informed consent. No protected areas if there is not the respect of right lands, culture, identity, institutions, all the rights of indigenous peoples. And of course now we know that we at the national level, we have the NDSAPs, that each country, because I think 193 countries are part of the convention, they will start putting this in the national actions plan, in the national policy. For this, and we have only 7 years, so it's up to 2030. And it's important that this spirit of construction, is the spirit of recognition of indigenous peoples, is also put in place. It's not misinterpreted, it's not used in the bad or not good faith. It's because for us it's like if the recognition of land and territories is done, we will be really doing the job to conserve biodiversity. For this, but of course also it is important that indigenous people take a key role, so active role. First, to empowering them, knowing what is in the framework, and also understanding this important tool, and also pushing at national level the implementation of the land rights at all levels, no? Because for us it is very important, as our sister was saying, this is our work, this is our reading, is everything for us, and we think that this is the best way to implement the biodiversity framework. Thank you.
Now we move to the second panelist. He is Dr. Terence Hay-Eddy, the program manager of the Global Consortium on the ICCA, Support Initiative. He is also the Climate and Energy Bureau of Policy and Programs Support / Global Policy Network United Nations Development Program. So, Terence, let's hear from you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gam. So, I was asked to address two main questions on this panel. The first was around the role of NBSAPs, Gam mentioned, the National Biodiversity Strategies and Action Plans, and the second one was on the matter of access to finance. So, on the matter of NBSAPs, the target after the COP15 is for all the governments to update their NBSAPs by 2024 by the COP16. And the kind of main message I want to convey is that for the developing countries, there will be a process by which UNDP and UNEP have received support from the Global Environment Facility to conduct national consultations and support. So UNDP will support 70 countries and UNEP will support 70 countries. So this is a major entry point to convert the targets agreed in Montreal into measurable, actionable action plans. In Montreal, we also launched a guide on, with the Office of the High Commission on Human Rights on integration of human rights into NBSAPs. And I'd like to just echo what Viviana was saying about how, in fact, the outcome in Montreal was, in a sense, and Joji, Carino, and many other representatives here this week in side events talking about the Global Biodiversity Framework recognize the many references to human rights, or at least enough to make it something that can then be referred to throughout the different targets. And I'll be available and other colleagues from UNDP here to discuss the NBSAP support rollout over the next 2 years as need be. Now, I'm going to go very quickly through the next question on access to finance to leave space in the agenda. So, I've been working now for quite a long time with the Small Grants Program, which is financed by the GEF and other donors, including Germany and Japan and various governments. And I won't go into all of the details. Some of you may know this program, but it's very decentralized. The funding goes directly to the NGOs, CBOs, Indigenous Peoples, with national governance systems, including Indigenous Peoples, on those national committees. And we're entering into the 8th cycle and thinking about how that's going to work in brief. But the question of, so there have been various evaluations of the SGP, and it was recognized as being the main or primary modality. Other agencies in the GEF are now developing new initiatives. But Vicky Talikopoulos, when she was UN Special Rapporteur, asked us to do an independent analysis of how much money is really going directly to Indigenous peoples, and this was conducted in 2019, and we found that if we disaggregated countries, the 90 countries where there are Indigenous peoples compared to the others, there was a fairly significant percentage of about 30%, and that includes regions like the Pacific. And we also found a trend of increasingly IP-led projects over that 20-30 year period, countries where NGOs may have been intermediaries in the past, increasingly with more direct access. This report is available. I won't go through all of the statistics and things from each region. From that, we did prepare a synthesis publication looking at 25 years of partnership with Indigenous peoples across a range of topics, from work we have done on Indigenous peoples fellowships to traditional knowledge to energy to, we had a side event on Monday about access to energy, and this report is available as well. But now coming back to the CBD, in 2010, when the AIPP targets were created, and Viviana referred to this acronym we always forget, Other Effective Area-Based Conservation Measures. This was an opening for Indigenous peoples back then in 2010. So, and now we are where we are with the new pathway, but in 2010 we created this initiative, Global ICCA Support Initiative, with the consortium that Jan referred to in partnership with the UNEP World Conservation Monitoring Center to try to support and assess and diversify the governance types of protected and conserved areas. So this started in 26 countries with regional networks and grant making at the national level in those countries, with a series of different methodologies, including the self-strengthening of areas, conserved areas, ICCAs, indigenous territories, through internal self-reflective methodologies. Then, in addition to that, at the global level, given that governments report protected areas through the World Database on Protected Areas, we also worked with WCMC to create this registry, which is voluntary, and a number of Indigenous peoples have been submitting their territories to this registry, and this will be counted for the targets, both for the AIPP targets and in the future. And then in 2021, there were a series of reports. The ICCA Consortium produced one on its Territories of Life report, and this is the second one I put up there, which is a lot of analysis. We often hear this 80% statistic of biodiversity in indigenous lands. This was an update on some of the earlier guesstimates through analysis with the World Conservation Monitoring Center. And then finally, this is my last slide, just to say that we were able to launch a new phase in Montreal, expanding to 45 countries. Primarily target 3 is the one we've been hearing about, but target 22 is very important in terms of the decision making. And then the fairly late on in the process, target 23 came in on gender. So we are just now in the process of starting this up, and look forward to working with everybody here, and thank you for the opportunity to speak.
To enhance the document and address the limitations and weaknesses, if any. We do not want to create a document repository for and of Indigenous people's rights. Hopefully, all concerned, especially the states, the corporations, and even other parts of the private sector, even civil society, we should all strive to bring life to this agreement, but alongside other human rights instruments and policies. So in line with this, we would reiterate our recommendation that states should ensure the full and just participation of Indigenous peoples in the drafting or even revising the national biodiversity strategies and action plans. And of course, in the implementation of the agreement and applying a reporting framework through community-based monitoring. 2, the UN DRIP, human rights, must be at the core of conservation. The GBF aims to address biodiversity loss, restore ecosystems, and protect Indigenous people's rights, and includes putting 30% of planet and 30% of degraded ecosystems under the protection by 2030. We think that without the commitment of safeguarding human rights, this 30 by 30 conservation target, or any target for that matter, would lead to further eviction of Indigenous peoples from ancestral lands, and of course the denial of access to critical resources needed to sustain our rights to land, food, and health. and we again keep on saying this, the indigenous peoples conservation models and the human rights-based approach have been proven efficient and effective. Thus, this should be the standard for any conservation project. States should respect our free, prior, informed consent in the creation or declaration of protected areas, allowing us to manage and provide this and provide the financial resources to support these areas. This commitment is very critical in realizing this target. But at the same time, let us also be cautious and critical on branding what is nature or community-based solutions to climate crisis, or even what is conservation. Because often, more than that, governments and corporations also use these terms. So we should go beyond the labels of what is conservation, what is nature-based, and what is community-based. Third, it's very, very important is to build effective development partnerships with indigenous peoples. Partnerships that recognize that we are right holders and development actors in our own rights, and it would include ending the practice of red tagging, terrorist labeling of indigenous peoples, leaders, organizations, and communities who are asserting our rights to self-determination, freedom of association, and expression. How can we contribute in good faith when states and corporations name us as criminals and terrorists? So let us build on our rich experience of cooperation, collaboration, and solidarity among indigenous peoples and between indigenous peoples and other similarly marginalized peoples and groups, and also partnerships with government and corporations. Fourth would be ensuring the inclusion of indigenous women and girls in the implementation of the agreement, especially the realization of Target 23 and the Gender Action Plan. Indigenous women and girls are part of the indigenous people's movement to defend land and for self-determination. They also play a very critical role in addressing climate change and environmental destruction. As always, we keep on saying, they hold valuable knowledge on sustainable indigenous practices. And without them, we cannot really say that there is gender equality without indigenous women and girls. Fifth would be on the enhancing the availability of reliable data. Our colleagues in the International Land Coalition is proposing to have disaggregated data to include indigeneity, ethnicity, gender, etc. in relation to data on indigenous peoples. And I would like to stress that the attacks against indigenous peoples, while it's vast, intense, these are actually widely underreported and undercounted. So we need the support to build our capacity to document, report, and monitor these violations. And at the same time, it might be helpful for human rights monitors to give the needed and appropriate attention into including these cases in their monitoring, because more often than not, we are lumped together as land defenders. So it doesn't give the needed attention and highlight on the role of indigenous peoples when it comes to land, environment, and climate defense. And probably we hope that with this kind of data, we are able to push more policy protection for indigenous peoples as human rights defenders. And my last point will be in relation to resources. I've always been campaigning, advocating for direct access to resources for indigenous peoples, especially at the grassroots. Something that is less bureaucratic, but at the same time being also probably with our inclusion in the GBF governance committees, we are able to design and come up with better ways of implementing these grants. The resources, I think, should be empowering, not divisive and corrupting of indigenous peoples and local communities. And at the same time, it would be best guided by indigenous values and principles of sharing, collective management, and the use and accountability of these resources to the common good, should also be our minimum guide when we appropriate these funds. So these are my 6 points. So thank you very much for listening. Back to you, Gam.
Thank you very much, Beverly, for raising those very important issues, those very important points. Now we will have a brief session on with people who will be providing some of their reaction to these panels that has been presented so far. So we will start with Oda Alma-Smith. He is the policy advisor, responsible finance program from Forest Peoples program. So Oda, please take the floor.
Thank you, Gam. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here with you all. So I wanted to take a couple of minutes to focus on the question of financial resources. When thinking about the massive attention we're seeing to scale up finance for biodiversity, it's important to keep a very focused eye on what all the finance mechanisms might mean for Indigenous peoples in terms of respect for their rights to self-determination, lands, territories and resources, to cultural integrity and to FPIC, as well as whether they provide access to finance and other benefits to Indigenous peoples themselves. And examples of the effort to scale up finance for biodiversity, as you know, can be seen in Target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which contains language on substantially and progressively increasing the level of financial resources from all sources, including from the private sector. And the target specifically mentions stimulating innovative schemes such as payment for ecosystem services, green bonds, biodiversity offsets, and biodiversity credits. And I think it's safe to expect that in response to the adoption of this target, there will be quite a lot of movement in the private sector and the emergence of new market-based mechanisms. And looking at one market-based mechanism that we already have some data on, the voluntary carbon market, it would be important to consider problems already experienced there in terms of quite chaotic and largely unregulated landscape with myriad of different standards and rules and with varying respects for rights of Indigenous peoples. And as many are probably very aware, there's quite a controversy relating to some carbon credit standards at the moment. For example, relating to negative impacts on land rights of Indigenous peoples and due to questionable environmental integrity. That is whether the credit actually represents real carbon emissions reductions or removals. So as I'm sure as many of you also know, one example found that, for example, 90% of the credits from one big carbon credit standard did not represent any carbon removals or reductions. So with the emergence of innovative finance schemes, it seems pertinent for Indigenous peoples to first really understand what all these different mechanisms are. What are green bonds? What are biodiversity offsets? What are biodiversity positive carbon credits? What are nature certificates? And these are only a few examples of all the different types of finance instruments we see coming. So only with full and balanced information can communities and peoples who will be approached about such mechanisms in the future in their territories meaningfully make their own decisions about whether they see benefits in engaging and partnering with other entities in designing such instruments. And only through being treated as equal partners in the design can they meaningfully influence the way that finance is potentially accessed by the communities. And only by fully understanding these proposed mechanisms can communities and peoples know whether the funding from such schemes can help strengthen their exercise of their right to self-determination, including their ability to own, use and manage their lands, which the Permanent Forum has already highlighted as an aim of direct funding. And lastly, only with that full information can communities and peoples make a decision about whether they actually agree conceptually with the idea that there is a need to put a price on nature so it can be traded in a market in order to save it, or the conceptualization of nature as natural capital, and the framing of ecosystems as services, the value of which are represented in terms of the contribution to human well-being. So in summary, I just wanted to take this opportunity to bring attention to the finance streams that are likely to come out of Target 19, and that there is quite a lot there to unpack. And already there are quite a few actors working on these different financial mechanisms. The positive point is that Target 19 already includes in reference to benefit sharing and to environmental and social safeguards, which we know from experience of the existing carbon markets will be very important for Indigenous peoples to be part of the designing. And very finally, there are already a number of Indigenous organizations and communities who have a lot of experience thinking through and seeking to assert their rights in the carbon market context. So some cross-fertilization on learning might be a good idea now that a set of new nature markets are on their way. I think that was it for me.
Thank you, Oda, for that very important piece of information. As we know, the world is very complex and it's very hard to navigate through all these complexities. But really an important point to cautioning us on understanding these finance instruments that are already out there and some of them that are coming in. Really important for Indigenous peoples to be educated and be really well informed so that good decisions can be made. So thank you so much. Okay, now we move on to our second reactor. He's Patrick Earle. He's the Executive Director of the Diplomacy Training Program, and I think he's very well known to Indigenous peoples because he has been imparting trainings for many, many years now. So there's so many Indigenous leaders who know him so well. So Patrick, please.
Thank you very much, Gam, for the kind introduction and also to the opportunity to participate in this important panel, and thank you to all the speakers as well. I feel like just now I've been through a very rapid learning curve, and it's a curve that I think is important to continue. So if I can just share some reflections. I'm very new to this area, and but it has been really very interesting to hear the range of speakers and to, if I can, to reflect, I think, on something that's important to us, which is this being the 75th anniversary of the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and acknowledging that that declaration came out of a profound crisis for the world. And we are now faced also with another crisis, and in terms of the climate emergency and the loss of biodiversity, and to hear how human rights are informing the responses in relation to the Convention on Biodiversity, the agreements that have been made. It's been very interesting, and I'd like perhaps to share some reflections on how a rights-based approach, what's needed to apply a rights-based approach in response. The other thing I've heard very strongly from a number of the speakers, which is relevant to another important anniversary this year, which is the 25th anniversary of the adoption by governments of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And we've heard, I think, how much human rights defenders, Indigenous peoples' human rights defenders, are at risk now in terms of protecting their lands and their resources, asserting their rights to participate. And it seems to me that this is a time really where we need to reaffirm, rededicate ourselves both to the UDHR and the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, see how they can be applied in the current context of national biodiversity strategy action plans. To really, what is called for in the agreements, it's very heartening to hear, is the application of a rights-based approach. And the application of a rights-based approach, a human rights-based approach to development requires a number of things. It requires rights holders to have knowledge and information, awareness of their rights and how to call for their rights and claim their rights in different contexts. That calls for capacity building programs and an investment in human rights defenders and their movements, in Indigenous people's rights and their movements. And that should be a part of the strategy and action plans that are being made. That capacity building needs to include building knowledge, awareness, understanding of existing international human rights standards, and I think a number of the speakers have referred to those. They include, most importantly, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, AIPP, and what it means. But it also includes other standards that have been developed and adopted. We've heard reference to the due diligence frameworks being developed, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So capacity building strategies need to, in a way, integrate all of these into their into the curriculum, the plans for capacity building. While rights holders need and have the right to be informed of their rights, there's also a need to sensitise governments to their obligations in relation to those rights. That also requires capacity building. There are a number of particular steps that need to be taken. And it's a reality of our current global environment that in some countries there are governments who are much more resistant to recognition in reality of the rights of their peoples. And that then therefore calls for international organisations who are mandated by international standards to be much more active in promoting awareness and understanding of rights, including the UN Declaration. But it also requires governments who have made commitments to the UN Declaration and other international human rights standards to be more active promoters of those rights in the context of the climate emergency, Convention on Biodiversity, in relation to asserting the rights of Indigenous peoples. We've heard, I think, from all the speakers about the importance of participation, the requirement of Indigenous peoples to participate in the realisation of their rights. That also requires that they feel safe to do so. And you can't have effective dialogue if one side of that dialogue feels that they're at risk for speaking out and for asserting their rights. So very concrete steps need to be made by all of the organisations involved in the development of these strategy action plans to affirm the safety of human rights defenders and Indigenous peoples' human rights defenders. For Indigenous peoples themselves to invest their time and their resources in these processes, they need to have a confidence that they can really affect the outcomes. They need to have a confidence that governments will be held accountable, that other duty bearers will also be held accountable, that they have the capacity to affect outcomes, but also to seek redress and remedy where things go wrong. One of the questions that arises for me, perhaps out of naivety, is whether the monitoring of the national biodiversity strategic action plans can be integrated or strengthened into existing human rights monitoring processes, whether that's being proposed as part of treaty bodies, UN periodic reviews, and into the work of the UN special procedures. It seems to me these are very important conversations. I think we've heard that from Viviana just how long it took to get to where we are now, but also the urgency of action. And that's a paradox almost, I think, sometimes of how long things can take, but also how quickly we need to act. It's clear we need to act with a sense of great urgency, but we also need to respect the time frames of Indigenous peoples also in their need to participate and be involved. Thanks very much for letting me.
Now we have one more person. We have Ellen, who is the Director of Rights, Climate and Conservation from the Rights and Resources Initiative. Ellen?
Thank you very much, Gam. I'm very much honored to be part of this panel and with the distinguished participants. So, yes, very happy to be here. I just wanted to share a few thoughts on, especially on the issue of rights and financing. As you all know, the Global Biodiversity Framework presents, in fact, a new way of working and realizing conservation outcomes, and the modus operandi is really through a rights-based framework. However, there are a number of issues and constraints that would allow for the realization of those goals. Notably, we see that at least up to 2 billion people live in areas that would require conservation attention, yet their rights to the lands and territories that they manage and customarily have rights to are poorly or illy recognized. Globally, communities have rights to at least 50% of the global land area, but our latest research shows that they have legal ownership over only 11% of this area. So, in tropical and subtropical areas, it represents 63% of community territories are not recognized at the moment. Not only are they facing issues around recognition of their land and territorial rights, but they're also facing challenges in terms of their ability to exercise the rights that they actually have. So self-determination, the ability to pursue their own self-determined conservation and climate actions and solutions are poorly defined and ill-enforced in most situations. Communities increasingly complain they have legal rights, paper rights, but they don't have real rights. Their ability to use the lands and resources that they own and manage and sustain. This is also tied to another impeding element, which is the fact that very few countries actually have legal frameworks that would recognize Indigenous community-led conservation. There's at the moment, less than a handful of countries that actually legally recognize such rights. And so if we're going to have a new biodiversity framework that actually supports rights-based approaches, then it's urgent that these new tools and instruments include rights-based frameworks in the protected area legislation and new ways of operating, especially if we're going to be implementing other effective area-based ecosystem approaches. Finally, I wanted to mention the issue of financing. Financing is a huge challenge for Indigenous people local communities. A recent study by the Rainforest Foundation in Norway showed that less than 1% of climate financing over the past decade has gone towards Indigenous peoples and local communities. And more recently, the climate pledge by donors, the $1.7 billion commitment that was made in Glasgow, only 7% of that money that so far has been dispersed has gone to community Indigenous organizations. Half of the money that has so far been dispersed has gone to large NGOs. So there's a huge disparity in terms of the amount of money going towards communities and their initiatives versus large international organizations. Linked to that is the fact that there are huge mismatch between the cultures and norms of donors and those of rights holder organizations. Most rights holder organizations have long-term financing needs and strategies, whereas donors have short-term 3, 4, 5 years frameworks. Capacity needs of community organizations are lacking in terms of their ability to sustainably use, manage, and benefit those financial resources. So capacity building, grant management tools and instruments need to be revised and updated so that they actually match the people that we're actually trying to support. And likewise, planning and reporting requirements need to be adapted. Luckily, we're seeing an increasing number of fit-for-purpose financing mechanisms, such as the Tenny Facility, the new Climate, Land, Community Land and Conservation Financing Initiative launched by the Rights and Resources. And we're seeing regional funds, such as the new Mesoamerican Territorial Fund, the Santerra Fund in Indonesia, or the Podali Fund in Brazil. All of these financing mechanisms are showing that communities are taking action into their own hand, creating the financing instruments, the tools that would actually allow them to pursue their own self-determined priorities. We just need now to have more direct support and more engagement to ensure that this is happening. And there are platforms and initiatives now being conducted, such as the Path to Scale Network, which convenes on a quarterly basis the world's donors and funding foundations, private sector foundations, to engage and identify pathways, new solutions, both to raise ambition in terms of scaling up funding, direct access funding for communities, but also revising donor modalities so that resources can actually reach the communities that need it most and can support their own self-determined conservation and climate priorities. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
I just would like to point out that this side event was organized by Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact and co-sponsored by Diplomacy Training Program, International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, the Forest Peoples Program, the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, United Nations Development Program, Rights and Resources Initiative. So I would like to thank all the co-sponsors and AIPP for this event. I just would like to say that yes, we have seen that there are still many challenges, whether in terms of capacity and how we practically would be applied and integrated the human rights-based approach on the ground. And also all these challenges that is still out there in terms of financial mechanisms as well as the financial instruments that FPP was raising. But perhaps if we are clear with the reasons behind these rights and the assertion of these rights, and if we stick to the spirit and the principles of this rights-based approach, still I do believe that it does offer some hope for all of us. So let's hope that that really happens for the good of humanity and the planet. So thank you very much. Lola, now over to you to do the closing.
Thank you very much, and I'm really honored and pleased to be here with all of you. I think it has been very enriching to hear all your interventions, and I think very complimentary in all the ways. So I would like to start by congratulating the Indigenous Peoples Forum on Biodiversity for its hard advocacy work to ensure that the coming Montreal Agreement include a specific reference to the respect of Indigenous people's right to land, territories and resources. So I think from all of us, I think a great recognition for what it has been achieved. All the panelists have shared their views, but I will just perhaps pick up on some common issues. And it's the issue of the need, talking about implementation, the need to ensure the full and effective participation. And what are the challenges there? And of course the challenges mentioned there is the capacity building, the need to understand fully the agreement. At the same time, the need of disaggregated data that it was mentioned. And the need for Indigenous peoples, and I think Beverly, you mentioned the need for Indigenous people, the capacity to document. I think in the context of implementation, documentation produced by Indigenous peoples is going to be crucial. There are many challenges in the implementation, there is no question, and they have been mentioned here. I also would like to mention another challenge is an interpretation. And I think Indigenous peoples need to interpret the Montreal Agreement according to the full recognition of their land and territorial rights. But Indigenous peoples should also establish alliances and partnerships, because states will try to interpret the agreement in a completely different way. So a lot of challenges ahead, but also taking some words of Beverly. I think we need to work together to ensure its implementation. Whether in some areas are weaker or stronger, but to work ahead together. And for those who want to IA's publication, The Indigenous World, this year includes an article about the Montreal Agreement, where all the achievements or how the agreement includes and refers to Indigenous peoples. Thank you very much, Carl, and congratulations with the event.
We have finished with all the panels and also closing, but people are still haven't come in. So I was wondering if you're interested, we can entertain 2 or 3 questions to the panels. Yeah, there. We can see the interest, so yeah, a few minutes. 1, 2, 3, we take those 3, yeah.
I'm Stella Tamang, and I'm from Nepal and belong to Indigenous people, named Tamil people. And I've been attending UN permanent process for a long time, and I'm coming now after 1.5 decades. So I'm just reflecting, what has been happening and in this 1.5 years. So with it related to the present health, human health and climate change, I think the present human health and climate change show the condition of human health and the health of Mother Nature. Human being and the nature is inseparable, and they have been coexisting from the very origin of human being. What I think is the present condition of human health and the way Mother Nature is communicating through climate change is not the natural growth and evolution of human being and the Mother Nature, but because of human unnatural intervention in or with human being and Mother Nature. Indigenous people who have been coexisting and living with Mother Nature has accumulated the wisdom and knowledge reflected in their language, culture, tradition, art, music, and song. I think we have the solution in that. The problem and the challenges we all are facing today related to human health and climate change is not so complicated and complex. We are making it so complicated and complex, and actually it's quite amazing. I think it's very simple. I don't want to sound very naive. Just stop doing unnatural thing and be natural. Can we be natural? Let's listen to Indigenous people, and there are so many things to listen and to learn. We talk about capacity building. Whose capacity building? I don't know why Indigenous people need to have capacity building in order to understand all this process, which is so complicated and complex. And the more we become complex and complicated, the more damage and destruction we will be doing to human life and Mother Nature. We do not need rights only, and we need responsibility. Can we have responsibility-based approach? Because right-based approach, I think it's not helping. So I just want to say at the end that let's stop damaging and destroying human life and the life of and Mother Nature. So thank you.
I'm from Manipur in northeast of India, bordering Burma. My question is to some of the panelists. In today's world, where 80% of the world's conflicts are happening in biodiversity hotspots, where indigenous people live, including one of our panelists who's from Burma here, where there is 300 aerial bombings going on your land. I wanted to know how the experts, indigenous experts, are going to put our heads and minds and our intellect together in a time of rising global wars. 10 to 15% of the soldiers who are sent by Russia to fight in Ukraine are from indigenous origins. So these are some of the concerns which are raised. I wanted to know if any of the experts are dealing. And I think one of our panelists spoke about nature markets. How do we explain to indigenous people about carbon footprints? I don't know, whatever. I mean, what are these new terms? Financial indigenous people who have been living in Manipur, those who do business are considered bad people. What are we trading nature now? And how do we make sense of these corporatization of our lives, our lands, and our wars, which are now continuously being hammered on us? How are we going to think about biodiversity and financing in this world at this time? So I think we are left with a lot of dilemma right now, and I think we need to start finding our collective solutions towards it. Thank you.
To make this brief. So in regards to one of the panelists' comment about needing to expand the definition of conservation, my question is how do we work together to prevent term exploitation of the word conservation? As we've heard from our panelists and other relatives here, the term is being used as a way for corporations and private interests to seemingly try to gain trust into the community. Our local indigenous people are assuming they mean good, and we know that's not the truth. And so is there a way to properly define what conservation is that actually centers the solutions of indigenous people and centers us in defining that properly and hold accountability to those that use that term to exploit us?
It's very problematic, just like yourself. My organization works with communities across the global triple belt that are facing questions every day where they are being faced with projects already on their lands. They have no idea what it is about. Sometimes somebody is already making money from these projects and they don't know that somebody else is making money from the carbon that is stored in their trees, for example. So, I mean, it's a situation of dilemma because you could say we don't want to know anything about this, these solutions are false, we want to cut them out. On the other hand, in order to fight them, you might need to know something. But it's an important question you raise because it also, there could be a counter argument of indigenous peoples are already presenting their own solutions. So if the focus could rather just be on really putting forward their own solutions to countries, which is what, continuing their traditional knowledge and their ways of life as they already are doing, then that is definitely a part of it. But I don't have an answer to your question, but these things are coming no matter what. These financial actors are already figuring out all these complicated systems to make money from the natural resources. So it's not an answer, but it's a comment.
I think anyway, it's a very useful comment to think about it. Thank you. Yeah, Ted.
Jan asked me to perhaps try to address the question on militarization, which is extremely difficult, but I think I would say that we've seen a trend in conservation where poachers are armed to justify arming conservation efforts. And what that leads to is an evolutionary arms race of increasing weaponization. And that has also fed into the way conservation has led to human rights abuses because people are armed and accidents happen. But fundamentally, that is a downward spiral. So maybe the Mahatma Gandhi talked about ahimsa, non-violence, that there need to be principles of non-violence in conservation as well. Because selling weapons for conservation is not going to be the long-term solution, I don't think, in any scenario. So that's more my personal view, but I think there is also various NGOs as part of the conservation and human rights principles and various other kind of networks that are thinking about how to implement conservation and human rights in a respectful and non-violent way.
Thank you, Terence. Beverly, would you like to respond to that question of definition and appropriation of that term conservation?
Yeah, but I would agree with you that wars of aggression has no place in humanity, and it's something I think that we should all work all together to stop. It's not only destructive to the environment, but it has resulted to much loss of lives and livelihood, and has caused much trauma. And two, I would agree that we should not be fighting wars of aggression of other states against other people, and that's something that we also have to probably inform our brothers and sisters who are involved, because for some it might also be a question of employment for many. And the term of conservation, I think we should expose it for what it is. I mean, if it's not conservation, but more of destruction, then we should expose it as such. We should also expose it for being false solutions. Especially now, I mean, even terms now, you have green financing, blue financing, and then these are being used to fund energy projects that would inundate communities. So for that matter, I think that has to be exposed, no? And two, I think for civil society or for people's movement, we also have to look into how states and corporations appropriate the terms that we have earlier used to define some aspects of our struggle, some aspects of the movement. And we should not allow that they appropriate the terms, misappropriate the terms for something that is totally the opposite of what we're doing. So, I mean, they've coined the term conservation, nature-based schemes. So let's go beyond the titles, let's go beyond the branding and look into the essence of these projects, of these policies, and then call them for what they are. If they're false, let's call them as false. I mean, that's for me, the way I look at it.
Yeah, thank you, Beverly. Yeah, all these issues are there, the appropriation by corporates in terms of these terms, conservation, or even these challenges around finance, and all these things. No? But just in short, I believe it's really, if we stick by the spirit and principle of the reason behind human rights-based approach and conservation and so on, I think that is the narrative that we have to strongly perhaps follow and promote, no? So that the other false narratives are exposed and are also defeated. No? I think that could be perhaps one of the ways that we can only insist. So it's our principle and our integrity that really counts in this fight. That would be one of the things that I would believe to be so. Well, I think we have overshot the time by a lot of... Okay, you want to comment on something?
Yeah, I just want to respond to everyone, and that I keep thinking in my mind of everyone saying that we are like captured into the position, the standpoint that everyone coming here might have a different position that we stand on, and we try to capture into it. And we also know that this is the space that we want to promote the rights of indigenous people, and it is also, this is the time that 22nd section, and how many more sections we need that, so in a way so that indigenous people really get the full enjoyment of what is mentioned in the UNPFII is a question. So for this, I think we need to think out of the box, and we have to come up with many creative ways, and I want to urge everyone to be the change maker in the way you can think it.
I think that's a very good way to end. So I would like to really thank everyone for your participation as well. So thank you very much.